Oliver, I want to know what we can about God. I've wanted to know my whole life. And if I have to divide the world into people who believe in God and what do they say, I would say that some say that God is a person, and some say that God is not a person. Not a person can be some consciousness, it can be the force of the world, it can be pantheism, a whole series of things. But the Judeo-Christian religions focus on God as a person. What does that mean for God to be a person?
It's a very good question. I think that there's a kind of loose and non-philosophical answer to that and a more strict and particular philosophical answer to that. On the loose and philosophical way, I suppose if you asked the person in the pew, as it were, or the average believer in the Judeo-Christian God, they would say, yes, of course, God is personal. And what's important is that in some sense, I'm in relationship with this personal God. That's not false, strictly speaking, but
to say it's personal is different than to say God is a person.
Right,
Those
exactly.
are two different things.
So I think it's consistent to say both God is personal, but then when it comes to the specific matter of what it means to say God is a person,
Yes.
to take it in a Trinitarian direction. And that's what the Christian is going to want to say. So I suppose...
But you don't have to do that. You can just ask the fundamental question, what does it mean for God to be a person? They then later can go to, is it 1, 2, 3, or however many you want. But the question is, what does it mean for God to be a person?
Right. That I see that. But if you're asking, what's the referent of the word God here and person? Are we talking about one single person? The Christian's going to want to say, well, strictly speaking, no, we're not. We're talking about three persons who are somehow all one God at the same time. Sometimes when people refer to God and they're talking about the person of God, they're probably referring to God the Father. But of course, one could also refer to God the Son. That's a distinct divine person in the Godhead, and God the Holy Spirit. So the question of person and God for the Christian is not quite as straightforward as it might be for someone who is simply a kind of monotheist. Of course, Christians are monotheists. They do believe that God is one, and they do believe that God is personal. But when it comes to the question of what do we mean by person and God, the Christian answer is there are three persons.
Oh, okay, I will give you that for the moment. Yeah. There are three persons. Pick whatever number you like. But what does it mean for each of them to be a person? What are the characteristics that each of them must have for me to say, yes, that's a person? I recognize you as a person.
Yeah.
What would it take for me to recognize any one of the three as a person?
Right, that's a good question. And I think here we come to a kind of difficulty in this respect, that in Christian theology, persons with respect to human persons is thought of in a rather different way usually than persons with respect to God. When we think of persons as in terms of human persons and human interaction on a personal level, we tend to think of a sort of conscious subject with a first-person perspective that's able to relate to another person. Now, in a sense, we want to say that about God, of course, too, but for the Christian, we've got to say that about three different persons in the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but in a way that doesn't pull them apart so that you have three gods, and that's what's tricky.
Oh, look, I certainly understand how that's tricky, but I'm still at a more fundamental level. I want to know what's the difference between my understanding a human person I know has independence, has a will, has I assume a theory of mind, self-consciousness, and desires and intents and agency, a whole series of things that I think that constitutes a person as a human person. I wouldn't say that about some animals that they're a person because they would have those in a lesser degree or not at all.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to talk about God as a person, whether it's 1, 3, it doesn't matter, what are the characteristics that God has to have for me to put that label? You said it's different for a human person and a God person.
Right. It's different for various reasons. I mean, partly because in the Trinity things are rather more complicated because you're dealing with three persons in one Godhead. Usually there's some sort of sense in which human persons are analogous to divine persons, though. So when you talk about persons in the way that you just have, I think those sorts of characteristics are obviously true of God. He's a person in that sense. He's able to relate to us. He wills certain things. He is capable of thought and is conscious and all of those sorts of things. But unlike finite, limited human persons, God's consciousness is infinite and is perfect. So you might think of God as a perfect being and a perfect person or a perfect tri-personal being rather than a sort of limited finite human person. But there's a sense in which, like you and I have a first-person perspective, and we can act in the world, we can relate to one another. So similarly, by analogy, God is able to do some of those things as well.
Are there any differences between the personhood of human beings and the personhood of God, or any of the three personalities in the one God, as you might put it? Do human persons have any characteristics that the person of God does not, or vice versa?
Yes, of course. I mean, persons that are human persons have the ability to do certain things that God can't do, like, for example, sin. I mean, human beings can therefore do actions that God can't, but usually that's not understood to be some kind of lack in God or some kind of failure of his perfection, but rather precisely because he's a perfect being and is a perfect kind of person, he's unable to do certain sorts of things that finite and fallen human beings can do. So yes, there are going to be differences, and important differences. Of course, the fact that my consciousness and my kind of first-person perspective is limited to what you see in front of you, this body and the purview of this body and its experience of the world, is also different in important respects. God's experience of the world, his ability to work within the world, is going to be significantly different from mine in virtue of the fact that, let's say, he's omnipotent, he's omnipresent, and he's omniscient, right? Three key characteristics of who God is. So God knows, in a sense, like I know, but his knowledge is perfect and immediate. God has power, like I have the power to do certain sorts of things, but God's power is, in a sense, without limit. And God is able to be present everywhere, in some sense, in a way that I am not. I'm limited to this particular physical body.
And the challenge is, if you have those kinds of characteristics, which are hard to imagine and are complex and difficult in themselves, can you still be a person if you are infinite in your consciousness, whatever that may mean,
Right,
and infinite in your power, and infinite in your knowledge? It sounds like that's stretching the concept of what a person would be. That's why I'm wondering, is there a coherence between God being a person and God having these infinite characteristics?
I'm not clear what would make it incoherent, but certainly I think it makes God significantly different from any kind of creature. And this is a way that Christian theologians have often thought about God, that it's not simply that God is a sort of greater sort of instance of a person like you and me. He's just a more perfect, a greater, more omnipotent person, but that there's something that's significantly different about the kind of being that God is. And that has to be captured in some way by what we say about the personhood of God, that there's something that's significantly disanalogous between the persons that we are and the way that we relate to one another, and the persons that comprise the Godhead and the way in which God is personal and the way he relates to us. So there's a kind of boundary, as it were, between creatures, including creatures like you and I, and the personhood that we possess, and anything that we want to say with respect to the divine personhood of God. And that has to be, that's an important thing that we have to hold on to.